Well, good evening and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Berkeley Forum. My name's Charlie and I'm the Vice President of Events here at the Berkeley Forum. We're a nonpartisan student-run organization that hosts free debates, panels, and talks on campus, and we're super excited to be co-hosting this panel on homelessness and food insecurity in the Bay Area with the help of the Residence Hall Assembly. Tonight, actually, our moderator will be going over the bios of all the speakers and we'll be introducing the format of the event. So without further ado, Aparna Iyer.
Thank you so much for attending tonight's session of the forum. So this is going to be a panel discussing the harsh realities of homelessness and food insecurity within the Bay Area. And as Charlie said, I'm just going to be going over the format of the event and introducing the speakers. So as I introduce each speaker, I'll give their bio and they'll each give a short presentation with kind of their point of view, and then we'll be moving into the moderated portion of the event. And we will be having audience questions at the end for anyone who's interested. So I'm excited to introduce our first speaker of the night, who's Mayor Jesse Arreguin. Mayor Arreguin was elected mayor on November 8th, 2016, becoming the youngest as well as the first Latinx person elected to office in a century. Since he took office in December 2016, he's worked to activate the Emergency Operations Center, the Berkeley Emergency Storm Shelter, Inclement Weather Shelter, and the Stair Navigation Center, modeled on best practices around the country. He's also initiated the Pathways Project to find both short and long-term solutions to the homelessness crisis in Berkeley.
So would you like me to give opening remarks?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to thank the Berkeley Forum for hosting an event on this important issue which impacts so many people, the issue of food insecurity and homelessness. And as students, every single day you see people who are living on our streets. And it really is unacceptable in the most wealthiest country in the world, and particularly in this state, which is the 5th largest economy in the world, to have such immense poverty in Berkeley and in the Bay Area and throughout the state. Homelessness is a statewide crisis, it's also a national crisis, and I do believe that while we need to take action on the local level and the statewide level, that it is the responsibility of the federal government to deepen its investment in public housing and securing safety nets so nobody is ending up on the streets and people have enough money to feed themselves, and that income inequality can be addressed. As of January 2019, Berkeley's homeless population was at 1,100 individuals. And we know that this does not show the full picture when it comes to food and housing insecurity. We believe there may be thousands of people in Berkeley who are housing insecure, many of whom may be couch surfing, for example, who may not be living in a tent on the street. We know that students are especially vulnerable to this predicament, with the lack of affordable student housing placing extensive pressure on our students and on our rental housing market. Students are also more susceptible to food insecurity. A 2017 report by the UC Global Food Initiative showed that 44% of undergraduates at UC Berkeley and 26% of graduate students are experiencing food insecurity. Given the seriousness of this crisis, the housing crisis, I have made it a priority during my time as mayor to deepen Berkeley's investment in addressing homelessness. One of the first pieces of legislation that I actually introduced when I took office in 2017 was the Pathways Project, which is a multi-pronged initiative to lift people out of homelessness. And the centerpiece of this initiative is the Stair Center, which is the East Bay's first navigation center. The navigation center is a 24/7 low barrier shelter. And so this is a shelter that provides a transitional housing, and we remove all barriers. You can bring your pets, you can stay with your friends, or if you have a partner, stay with your partner. Oftentimes restrictions on pets, restrictions on hours, and rules and curfews are a barrier for people to be able to access shelter. The Stair Center removes all those barriers and is focused on trying to house people that are in our navigation center. And so a key piece of the program is our rapid rehousing staff and our rehousing money. And since the program opened in late June of 2018, we've been able to house over 100 individuals through this one program. And we're looking at expanding the program to provide shelter for more individuals. Housing is the solution to homelessness. And so the more we can focus on not just meeting the basic needs of people, but focusing on providing housing resources, we can permanently end people's homelessness. The success of this program has actually inspired other cities in the East Bay to create navigation centers based on our model. Key to ending homelessness is also stemming the tide of homelessness, making sure people do not become homeless. And so the City Council, under my leadership, has not only significantly increased its funding for shelter, for mental health services, for basic needs services, housing resources. We actually spend more per capita than any other city in the East Bay. Clearly, there's a lot more we have to do. But we also have significantly increased our funding for anti-displacement programs. City Council this past budget put in $900,000 for a number of programs, including providing emergency rental assistance. So if you're facing eviction, you need $200 or $300 for you to pay your rent. We will provide a one-time cash grant for you to be able to pay your rent. We've increased legal resources for people who are facing eviction, and so people are aware of their rights and can advocate for their rights. We have a wide number of tenant protection laws in the city of Berkeley, but low-income tenants and moderate-income tenants need to have legal representation so that they can represent themselves and make sure that they are defending and asserting those rights in the case of actions by landlords. And also key is increasing funding for affordable housing. And so I helped write and led an effort on the Berkeley City Council to pass last election Measure O and Measure P. Measure O is a $135 million bond to build affordable housing in the city of Berkeley. And Measure P is an increase in our transfer tax to fund homeless services. So we've done a lot in Berkeley, but anyone who walks on Telegraph Avenue or the downtown knows that homelessness is a growing crisis. And so there's a lot more that we have to do. And I look forward to the conversation this evening to hear your thoughts and answer your questions about how we can do more to address the crisis of homelessness.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Our next speaker for tonight will be Candace Elder. Candace Elder, an East Oakland native, is the founder and director of the East Oakland Collective, or EOC. She studied political science with a minor in African American Studies at UC Berkeley and did her master's in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati. She founded the EOC to address the disinvestment and lack of resources in East Oakland, as well as the lack of representation of East Oakland residents in local politics and governing bodies. Additionally, she served on the advisory committee for the Breaking the Silence Town Hall on Women and Girls of Color in Oakland from 2015 to 2016, an annual town hall creating space to amplify, educate, and advocate in support of girls and women of color in Oakland.
Good evening. It's definitely an honor to be here tonight at my alma mater, as well as I used to stay in Unit 1 before all the renovations. I started the East Oakland Collective over 3.5 years ago, and we actually did not initially start off working with the unhoused population. And I intentionally use the term unhoused because for a lot of community advocates, especially in Oakland, to us it means it covers the entire spectrum of people who are facing housing insecurity. So that's whether you are couch surfing, whether people are riding the bus or the BART, in order to have safety and shelter at night, as well as RV dwellers, car dwellers, you name it. So we are actually experiencing a new wave of homelessness, and education and changing the narrative is part of the work that we do, because we are not experiencing kind of like the 1980s, 1990s chronic homelessness of that era, but we are seeing teachers, we are seeing college students, we are seeing transitional age youth, on the street. So EOC, we do advocacy, policy, and organizing work. I'm from Oakland, born and raised, so I can't help but take a grassroots approach to everything that I do and the strategies that we implement. So I see that the solutions to homelessness and actually tackling food insecurity is threefold. First, you do have to meet the immediate needs. People are in dire situations on the street. You know, we walk by people, we see and drive by the encampments, which actually I call curbside communities. So we kind of see the conditions that people are living in. I actually co-led the United Nations last January on a tour of Oakland curbside communities, which led to the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing writing a report naming Oakland as one of the human rights violators for the conditions that people are living in. Oakland, we are experiencing, according to the latest Alameda point time count, about over 4,000 unhoused folks. To us, it's a way higher number. Being in the trenches and being on the street and servicing this population and looking at data actually from Alameda County Healthcare for the homelessness, we think the numbers in Oakland are actually over 9,000 people who are unhoused. So we have to meet the immediate needs, and that is providing provisions. That is food, that is clothing, that is also sanitation. So my organization, we have worked to get some of the first sanitation units in partnership with the city of Oakland and curbside communities that were going with our resources for a long time. And we continue to advocate and work with the city to place more sanitation units. And those, in case you guys don't know, are the toilets and the hand washing stations and also trash pickup. So how do we live, whether you're unhoused or housed, how do we live in compassionate communities, and how do we, how we be good neighbors to each other? And that is dealing with some of the environmental and health factors that people are facing out on the street. To date, my organization has distributed 30,000 lunches and hygiene kits to 5,000 unhoused people across Oakland. And we have solicited the help of over 1,500 volunteers to do so. The second approach that we take to tackling homelessness is pushing for funding for short-term solutions and really kind of being innovative and creative solutions. And that is actually having sanctioned and intentional curbside communities, because we're not going to build our way out of this crisis tomorrow. So it's only going to get worse. So we have to see how are we going to shelter people now, and that is applying more funding to, like the mayor of Berkeley said, to navigation centers and to increasing the number of shelter beds. I actually advocate for we go even a step further, and that is we look at tiny homes, we look at container homes, we look at more RV safe parking sites, and because we're seeing that there needs to be a paradigm shift of what home means to people. We are seeing a move towards out of the box types of housing. Not everyone wants to go into your traditional apartment or home anymore, and then the length and time that will take to get a person to have economic stability and probably workforce development and training, it takes too long. So what can we do now? And then of course, on a long-term solution is deeply affordable housing. The cost of living in the Bay Area is extremely high. And all three of these things we have to work on simultaneously.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, our final speaker for tonight is Sarah Hunter. Sarah Hunter is a senior behavioral scientist at Rand and a professor at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. 10 years ago, Sarah started working in the field of supportive housing for individuals experiencing homelessness as an evaluation consultant for Skid Row Housing Trust. In 2017, she and her colleagues produced a report on LA County's Housing for Health supportive housing initiative that described changes in county service utilization and health functioning among individuals enrolled in the program. She's currently active on the homeless policy and research field. She's the lead evaluator on a number of supportive housing initiatives, including the LA County's Breaking Barriers and the Jail in Reach Pay for Success initiatives that target individuals under criminal justice supervision.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here, and good evening, everyone. As she mentioned, I'm a researcher in the field, and at RAND, we're a non-partisan and nonprofit research organization, and we're based in Santa Monica. As mentioned, I've been working on projects involving vulnerable populations, including the homeless, for quite some time. And one of our recent studies, we looked at the first 900 people that were experiencing homelessness and identified in the health system, and they got what's called permanent supportive housing. And what that is a long-term subsidy, basically for life, coupled with case management services. And we looked at what happened once people were housed by comparing their service utilization across a variety of different county services, including their utilization of health services, mental health, substance use, law enforcement, general relief, which is a cash subsidy people can receive. And we compared that to a year before they were housed to the year after they were housed. And what we saw across the first 900 people that were enrolled in this program, a dramatic reduction in their use of county services after they were housed, especially for expensive care like emergency room visits and in-hospital stays. And if you look at even taking into account the cost of the housing, the case management that people got, there was still a 20% savings to the county by providing the housing and case management to these individuals. So it really made a great convincing argument to both sides of the aisle of the value of providing housing and case management to people experiencing homelessness. This work has led to other initiatives, and some of them including, maybe a not so happy story is following up with individuals who receive permanent supportive housing and the struggles they encounter once they're housed. So after you get housing, we hope that people do better, but there's actually little evidence to suggest that people's health gets better after they receive housing. When we went out and conducted in-depth qualitative interviews with some of these participants, we learned that they really, although they're now housed, they really are challenged to thrive in these environments. And one of those challenges is having access and getting healthy meals. So a lot of individuals in these settings, they might have never lived on their own, so they've never really learned how to prepare and cook and feed themselves. Or oftentimes they have chronic health conditions that prevents them from being able to prepare, cook, and eat healthy on a regular basis. And this is really problematic because a lot of people in these settings have chronic health conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes, where having a healthy meal is really critical for their health and quality of life. So on that front, we've kind of figured out, we know that housing is a good solution for people who are experiencing homelessness, but we are still challenged to do more to help people thrive once they obtain housing. And I don't really know what the answer is, but I'm looking to learn about maybe some innovative strategies that we could then go research and test if those are available, and learning from all of you your good ideas.
Thank you, Professor. And once again, thank you all so much for your presentations. So we'll now be moving into the moderated Q&A portion of the event. To start off with, as some of you touched on, federal funding programs have recently prioritized permanent housing solutions, resulting in a decrease in the number of temporary shelters and other emergency options in the region. How, if at all, has this transition affected the scope of the crisis? And any of you feel free to start.
I can jump in from a local government perspective. One of the mandates to receive federal funding for certain homeless programs is that local agencies have to implement a coordinated entry system. And so Berkeley was the first city in Alameda County to implement coordinated entry. What coordinated entry is people who want to access shelter or housing go through one agency, one door. And so in the city of Berkeley, we have a nonprofit organization called BACS, Bay Area Community Services. that runs our coordinated entry program. And there are certain criteria under federal law that we have to prioritize chronically homeless individuals, people who are disabled, people who have medical needs, as well as transition-age youth. And so those populations get prioritized for permanent supportive housing. And since we've implemented our coordinated entry system, we've been able to house over 200 individuals just through the hub, the coordinated entry system. As I mentioned, our navigation center programs house about 120 people in its first year. It's about 60% rehousing rate, which is pretty high for most programs. So the national model is moving towards housing. Housing first is not only the focus of HUD and the federal government, but also is a proven best practice. If you can house somebody, as one of the speakers said, you have a much better time of not only ending their homelessness temporarily, but permanently with those wraparound services, make sure that they can get the help that they need and stay housed. What this has meant that there's less money available for emergency shelter and for other basic needs. And historically, our focus in Berkeley has been shelter and basic needs, what we can do to make people's lives more comfortable who are living on our streets. And so that has meant that local government and state government has to step in and kind of backfill that money. While my focus is on housing, I think we need to focus on getting people that are in shelters connected to permanent housing, because we do not want them to stay houseless permanently. We do need to increase the number of shelter beds, because we know that we have 1,100 people in Berkeley, we have about 350 shelter beds. There's a pretty big gap. So as the crisis is deepening, I think there needs to be much more focus on a variety of different ways that we can shelter people that I think Candace talked about. It's not just increasing shelter beds. Some people don't want to go to shelter beds. Some people want to live in intentional communities. Some people want to live in RVs. Some people want to live in alternative housing models. So we have to look at all those different approaches and think about how we can deliver shelter in a variety of different ways.
Either of you have anything that you'd like to touch on? You kind of took all my answers, but you know, a cut in funding is definitely a step in the wrong direction. You know, cities across California are looking to the state, you know, looking for more federal funding. And now kind of like all eyes are on California, you know, no thanks to the president, you know, for saying that we need to clean up California streets. But California carries really the bulk of the unhoused population in the United States. So with that, we need increased funding so that we can have more shelter beds, so that we can have more transitional housing, like the Henry Robinson Center in Oakland, and also other models such as SROs and safe RV parking sites. But what we're also seeing a shift in is calling for that people from all sectors, from the government, from private, nonprofit sectors, even tech companies, we all need to, and of course funders and philanthropists, we all need to come together and sit at the table and carve out these housing solutions. We see that between what Apple, Facebook, and Google, there's was it $1 billion pledged or recently?
Several billion.
2.5 billion, 2.2. So $2.2 billion pledged to housing, you know, just to kind of address some of these needs. And we know it's going to take more than that, but it's an act of good faith that and an example that we need, in addition to federal funding, we need everyone on board. Professor.
Yeah, just to sort of back out what my colleagues have said here is that on any given night in the United States, there's over 500,000 people that are homeless, and over 25% now are in California. So we do experience the sort of the bulk of the issue. That being said, you may, if any of you have been to New York City recently, although they have a visible homeless problem, it's not nearly like what you see on our streets, because there was a legal settlement passed there that requires shelter. Because as you can imagine, it's very cold there. People can literally die on the streets due to the weather. And so 70% of the homeless population in California is, I think now it's even up to 75%, the last count, are unsheltered. So we have a very visible homelessness issue on our hands, and lack of just this very imbalance between the temporary shelter versus more permanent housing options. But we're clearly lacking a lot of permanent housing options because of the depth of the situation here in California.
In terms of something that was mentioned earlier, private companies such as Kaiser Permanente and Cisco have recently put forth funding to address the issue of homelessness in the Bay Area. What, if at all, are the implications of having private companies involved in an issue that's often addressed by state actors?
I mean, with the reality with Kaiser, I mean, there's a lot of health plans coming to the table to provide housing because they're seeing it. It's affecting their bottom line. Like our studies show, this dramatic reduction in people cycling in and out of emergency rooms and the hospitals due to having no other place to go for their health care, which happens oftentimes with people experiencing homelessness. While it's encouraging, they are really doing this out of business. It makes good sense in terms of business for healthcare to be providing housing because housing is healthcare.
Yeah, following up on that, Alta Bates Hospital, which is our local emergency room, they see on any given night a significant number of people who are unhoused, who either have emergencies or are sheltering in their ER because it's a safe and warm place for people to be, and they actually have a program to connect people to services and to housing resources because they recognize that they are increasingly playing a social service role to help people who are experiencing homelessness. So I do agree, this is kind of a preventative step on the part of healthcare providers to invest in housing and shelter as a preventative measure so that people are sheltered and are not and have the support they need so that their health does not reach a crisis point when they're coming to an ER. But I think it's critical to have the engagement of the private sector. I mean, we can't do it alone. Berkeley, we are a city of about 120,000 residents. We actually have the highest number of homeless people per capita of any city in Allegheny County. Oakland has over 4,000 in the point-in-time count. Our point-in-time count is about 1,100 people. We know there's thousands of more people that are homeless, either who are unsheltered or are living in temporary accommodations. And certainly we know that there are students who are experiencing homelessness as well, which is totally unacceptable. We need to work with the university to increase housing, particularly affordable housing for students. And so, we do not have as big of a budget as San Francisco or Oakland to be able to tackle this really growing humanitarian crisis. So we need to engage the private sector, we need to engage state government, we need to engage the federal government to work in partnership with us. So in Berkeley, we've been able to get money from Kaiser Permanente for some of our programs, and I think we all need to work in partnership. This is really a community-wide responsibility.
Now, regarding the issue of healthcare and basic needs, according to the National Institute of Health, one issue faced by homeless communities is the lack of access to resources like clean drinking water and sanitized bathrooms. How, if at all, should governments balance addressing basic needs issues with more long-term policy solutions such as housing development?
I'll take a step on this one. Huge advocate for sanitation, addressing basic needs, while people are living on the street in these conditions, because it takes like 5 to 10 years to build a deeply affordable housing. It takes sometimes months to do intentional communities, to do RV sites. So while we are waiting for these either temporary or long-term housing solutions, people are suffering on the streets, and they need shelter options. So addressing the immediate needs, we definitely don't want to overlook that. So, it's been, a great thing for my org to work with the city of Oakland. We are working on a pilot program with the county of Alameda, identifying at least 5 sites across the county, one in Berkeley, several in Oakland, Castro Valley, cities like that, where we can actually increase the dollar of what the city is providing, and then go steps further, like to provide fresh drinking water. Because right now we have people like tapping into the water hydrants and doing stuff just to survive, and people shouldn't be. So, and also laundry services and shower stuff that many of us take for granted. So on the policy, so we have to look at on the policy side, what does that mean? Housing is a human right. Housing should be guaranteed. It should be housing first. Stuff as this basic necessity, such as water, should be first. So I personally don't do work and policy work in those areas, but at a local level, we are working with like the city council, and the city administration of Oakland to see like how can we increase budget allocation and dollars to go to these services. Because right now Oakland is estimated at 100 curbside communities, but we only are applying sanitation to about 20-25 of those communities. So we see that there's a huge gap. So what policy and practices, do we need to put in place to ensure that there's actually more funding for those type of resources, and then that translates further, into the long-term permanent housing.
Either of you have anything you'd like to add?
I'll just add that while housing must be the priority, not just building more housing, particularly housing that's deeply affordable for low and very low-income households. I do think we are facing a housing affordability crisis, not just in the Bay Area, but throughout the entire state of California. And we're not going to build our way out of this crisis immediately, but that doesn't mean that we should let up on our responsibility to continue to build more housing, and particularly ways that we can provide subsidized affordable housing. Because if you are homeless, a $6,000 a month apartment is not going to be affordable. So that's, I think, the responsibility of state and local government to provide our resources to help subsidize affordable housing, provide rental subsidies to make housing affordable and accessible for people. But I do think more broadly, we are facing a housing crisis. It's many decades of lack of production and a booming regional economy. We've seen thousands and thousands of people that have come to the Bay Area, and we have not seen cities like Cupertino or Palo Alto who have stepped up and built housing for the thousands of employees that they brought to their communities. So one of the hats I wear is I'm the vice president of Association of Bay Area Governments, which is our regional planning agency. And we're beginning a process around how we're going to allocate the need, the regional housing need. And I do believe that there's got to be more focus on not just having urban areas meet their responsibility, but job-rich communities building housing. But we are facing a crisis now. We do need to have more restrooms. We do need to have more hand washing stations. We do need to deal with the current emergency that we're seeing in our streets.
Professor, is there anything that you'd like?
No, I agree with my colleagues, and someone said this to me and it really resonated, the idea of supportive housing. We all live in supportive housing. We all have someone come and take our trash and give us clean water. And why we think that people that don't have a roof over their head should not have the access to those same resources just is really a bizarre kind of concept, and we should be thinking differently about the concept of supportive housing, and that we all deserve and need it.
One related issue that stems from that of the homeless crisis is that of mental health. A study by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development found that nearly half of all homeless individuals have some form of mental illness. How, if at all, should policymakers take mental health into consideration when addressing homelessness?
I'll just kick off by saying I don't think it's enough of a priority, frankly, in the conversation on homelessness. It's just absolutely unacceptable. We see so many people on our streets who are really in crisis. And our mental health system is absolutely broken. And so there's got to be more focus on crisis response. Our police officers should not be the ones to respond to calls when somebody's in a crisis. It should be mental health workers. There needs to be more focus on treatment. So it's a real challenge. And I think a lot of the conversation's been on housing and shelter, but we also have to deal with the mental health crisis as well, because until we address that, it's going to be hard for people to be ready to transition into housing and stay housed and be housing secure. So I think that's got to be a really critical piece of the conversation.
I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that while someone their mental health may have exacerbated their situation and may have partially contributed to them becoming homeless, oftentimes living on the street also exacerbates mental health symptoms. And so it's really hard to kind of like tease those apart over time. And yeah, I mean, the issue we have on our hand is due to decades and decades of neglect and of our mental health system and not putting enough resources behind it to serve all those in need.
And I would just like to add to the mental health issue, we know it's an extremely ignored and prevalent problem, within our communities. But also I want to add a trauma-informed lens, that, health professionals and doctors and even community advocates and folks that go in the field need to be aware of. There are folks on the street who spiraled down due to everything, you can imagine, like loss of death, of family members, loss of support system, depression, and unaddressed trauma. So what counseling services, what additional services that we need to actually, get people to where they're at, where they can actually survive and thrive, in transitional or permanent housing.
So looking at the issue at large, some proposed solutions in the Bay Area, including Fremont's Homeless Navigation Center, have faced widespread opposition from the local communities on public safety, amongst other issues. How, if at all, can such initiatives incorporate and respond to concerns that are raised by residents?
I'll just kick this off by saying that I think there are two bills that must pass this legislative session. One is a statewide right to shelter. I think that should be the law, and there should be money set aside to meet that mandate. It's touched upon New York's policy. I think a right to shelter with an actual funding commitment by the state government will really help local governments and counties actually be able to shelter people. But another thing is we need to remove the regulatory barriers to being able to create shelter. There was a bill in the legislature by Senator Scott Wiener, which did not move forward this past year, which would have made the permitting new shelters and navigation centers by right. It should be by right. I'll just say from my own personal experience in the city of Berkeley, we've dealt with this issue. Berkeley is a very progressive and compassionate city, but when something is going to actually be built next to somebody's home, then we hear from those very neighbors who say we need to address homelessness. I don't want that in my backyard. So a couple of examples. One, it took a long time to find a location for our navigation center. A lot of that was due to resistance from business owners and from residents who live adjacent to some of the sites. We opened a emergency shelter in West Berkeley that was on University Avenue, right next to a residential neighborhood. The amount of opposition and resistance that we heard from those neighbors about keeping the shelter open was surprising and disheartening. We kept it open anyways, but the same people that said, I don't want to see a homeless person on my street, I'm tired of seeing an encampment, said, we don't want to keep the shelter open, I'm afraid for my safety. And then we're actually trying to find a location in Berkeley for a safe parking site for up to 50 recreational vehicles, and the amount of resistance that we face from businesses has been just incredible. I will note those businesses said, we don't want RVs in Berkeley. So their solution is let's kick RVs out of Berkeley, but I don't want to find a safe parking site that's near my business. So we gotta get past this resistance to being open-minded towards finding solutions. And I also think we need to break the stigma. We need to actually educate people about homelessness. Who are the homeless? Why are they homeless? There's a great deal of misunderstanding and stigma and bias that colors a lot of these conversations. And I think that's got to be more of the responsibility of local and the private sector to have that conversation, a hard conversation. Sorry, my soapbox. I said this at a city council meeting on Tuesday, that people that want to support addressing the issue of homelessness can also say, not in my backyard.
Good soapbox to be on, because we are facing an extreme level of not in my backyard. And actually in Oakland, it's why curbside communities are being moved so often is because the communities that get the most complaints by house neighbors, by the surrounding businesses, are the ones that are usually moved first, because the city has to try to balance, all their constituents. They can't put one over the other. But we are in a time where there's nowhere for people to go. Yeah. So unless there is somewhere for this population to go, I actually advocate, and a lot of my colleagues advocate, that you do not move people. You actually let them be. You upgrade, not evict, which is exactly what the United Nations recommendations were, until you can provide adequate housing. So that means providing those immediate needs, those sanitation, and there has to, thank you for saying that, has to be education. How do we build compassionate communities? How do we live next door, to one another? Because even the most well-intended people who care about the unhoused, but as soon as you try to put something next to them in their neighborhood, it's like, no, we don't want this here. I've actually tried several attempts to open pilot programs, and just so pushback from the neighbors actually led us to, we couldn't use that piece of property. There is tons of property, at least in Oakland, that is vacant and that we can actually move people onto, but we have to get the buy-in from the residents. Last year, my organization, as a part of a coalition called the Housing Dignity Project, we actually reclaimed, did something totally, off the charts, grassroots, reclaimed public land that had been vacant in East Oakland for over 20 years, and we only lasted for 30 days. This was a women of color and children-led effort. It was 13 women of color and their children and their partners who were on this land, and we only made it 30 days because all the uproar from the neighbors. And it was neighbors who were actually probably lower income homeowners who were worried about their home value, going down, or they had worked so hard to buy this property. So what is the impact of an encampment, even though this was a really nice one and really well run, and actually, provided resources to the entire community, but what was the impact or the optics of that going to be on their home and on their living environment? So the city evicted us, after 30 days. It was a very crazy and traumatic experience, but it really taught us about how important it is at the same time to have the community, input, and changing the narrative is key. We are not looking at stereotypical unhoused population where, all these negative stereotypes where people are on drugs or are alcoholics, or, they're suffering from severe mental illness. We have teachers, we have people who go to work every day. We have people in the gig economy, we have entire families living in their vans and their cars. So it's really hoping to expose the different narrative of who is living on the streets and why, that hopefully people will care more. We get people will care more from different sectors and invest their time, energy, and money into helping, all the cities, solve this crisis.
Professor, is anything you'd like to add? All right, for the sake of time, this will be my last question before we move on to questions from the audience. Touching on the issue of hunger and food insecurity, 11.5% of Bay Area residents, about 870,000 people, are reported to be food insecure. Given the federal oversight that controls the issue, what, if anything, can be done on a more local level to address the issue?
I think feeding people is one of the easier and most simple things that anyone can do. So whether it's investing more dollars into our local food pantries, investing more dollars into the organizations that the food pantries partner with and provide like emergency provisions, and kind of make sure that that is equally spread across the city. My organization, we're very inspired by the Black Panther Party, and we believe in feeding our own people. So, which is why we started, a lunch program. We also, we do what I call food reparations. There's a lot of food waste and excess food, in this society. So I'm glad to see the emergence of these food runner companies, people who are repurposing food. So every week I pick up 400 pounds of food left over from tech companies, and I'm just one organization picking up that. So there's tons of other organizations who pick up, and we repackage and we bring it all the way out to Oakland. It's a 3-hour round trip for me. And we redistribute that food to people in need, and it's anyone in need, whether they're unhoused or they're no to low income. Also, we work and partner with other organizations who, sign people up for benefits like CalFresh and SNAP. And we're also, partnering with organizations to, mobile farmers markets, and making sure that a lot of these fresh, sustainable food programs are accessible, to people who either normally don't shop, at these places, or can't afford to, go to your Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or your larger farmer market on the other side of town. So making sure that, fresh and sustainable food is accessible and is at a low cost, and that these federal programs can apply to them. So I'm really happy to see over the past umpteenth years that there's EBT and whatnot can be accepted, so people can swipe their cards at their local farmers market. And even local farms are going as far as to doing the CSA boxes, the home delivery boxes, and giving discounts to people who are on state benefits.
What she said. Not just there is more availability now for SNAP and CalFresh, and I think is actually getting people signed up for those benefits is extremely important. And I think that's something that we could do as local governments, and working in partnership with our nonprofit partners. In Berkeley, we have an agency called the Berkeley Food Network, which actually just opened in September, and they are taking food donations and working with student organizations. They're working with a variety of nonprofits in Berkeley to increase access to food. I will say we have a lot of churches and organizations in Berkeley that provide meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner. So it's just a matter of letting people know where to access those resources. I think UC Berkeley's done a great thing with their food pantry. I'm glad that the university initiated that because the number of food insecure students it's actually shocking. It is absolutely unacceptable, and I think we need to do a better job also of letting students know about the resources we have available to fill that gap as well. So,
Any of you have any last thoughts before we move on to questions from the audience? All right. Thank you so much for answering all of my questions, and we'll now be moving on to audience Q&A. So if you have a question for any of our speakers, please raise your hand and I'll call on you, and when I do, just remember to speak up and be as concise as you can. Audience questions? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. I just had a question. I guess this is more directed at Mayor Arreguin, who's now student city. At the beginning in your opening statement, you talked a lot about how there's a lot of resources now more than ever that are available to homeless individuals or people who need rent assistance. Like we talked about how they can get a quick grant if they need it. My question is, how do people know those things are accessible to them? So how does that average person who's living in People's Park actually get access to those resources?
I think you touch on a really good point, which is We have a lot of resources. There clearly is more we have to do, but how do people become aware of those resources is a big challenge. I think outreach it must be a priority. Actually, I was able to persuade Chancellor Chris to fund a social worker that actually does outreach and engagement with unhoused people in People's Park and in the broader Telegraph area. And that individual has been able to make contact with nearly every single unhoused person in the Telegraph People's Park area, and has worked to get people housed, connect them with services. And so outreach is really a critical piece, whether it's through outreach workers or through nonprofits, so that people know about, so we understand what do people need. We need to really go person to person, build that trust, understand what do they need? Do they need food? Do they need housing? Do they need shelter? What do we need to do? Working with them one-on-one to provide those resources. So I think that's an area where Berkeley, frankly, needs to do a better job. It needs to do a lot more. And my hope is in the coming year we can significantly expand the number of outreach workers we have going out in the streets and engaging with people, because that has been an effective intervention to be able to make that one-on-one contact and build that trust. So.
Any other audience questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for speaking. So I represent the School of Public Health in one of their ending youth homelessness research groups, and so we actually got funded by the Chancellor's Grant to conduct a needs assessment.
Yes.
Yeah, Coco, no, yeah, you know Coco? Yeah.
Yes, so yeah.
Yeah, so we're actually funded to conduct a needs assessment survey next January, February, and so like an hour ago we were still talking about what domains we wanted to focus on in the survey, so I wanted to get your input on what data you think the city of Berkeley is like desperately lacking, because I am aware of the point in time counts, but I know that it's very limited in what I can do. So yeah, my question is just what domains or questions should we really focus on?
And this project's about the needs of transition age youth. Correct?
Yeah, or just youth experiencing homelessness. Yeah.
I mean, I think there are kind of two categories. I mean, there are, we have about 300 students in the Berkeley Unified School District that meet the federal definition of homelessness under the McKinney-Vento Act. And so we need to kind of know more about those students and families and what do they need. And City of Berkeley is actually looking at having dedicated funds in our homeless budget to meet the needs of homeless students and families. But with transition age youth, oftentimes they're not at the Yay shelter. They're not on Telegraph Avenue. And so how do we make contact with people so that we can understand what they need? And that's been a challenge with these point in time counts. So by federal law, every 2 years, you have to do a count of your unhoused population. And so it is a point in time. It's who you count that morning or that day. That doesn't mean that everyone's gonna be at People's Park. That doesn't mean that everyone's gonna be on Telegraph Avenue. So you're undercounting a lot of people. So I think that's gonna have to be a key piece of it. It's like accessing the service, working with the service providers, and really making contact with people to understand what their needs are. I think is really critical because there's a pretty big gap in information that we have right now, for particularly that population.
And building on that, asking questions of where they stay, where they feel safe, where they would feel comfortable accessing services, and how they would like to be approached and access services are things that we don't really know so much about that